night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay for centuries on past, for no more than your brain have bled for your countries and counted your days.
You're listening to WLPN 105.5 FM Chicago. You're listening to Labor Express Radio, Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. News for working people by working people. I'm your host, Jerry Mead Lucero, and this is Sunday, November 11th, 2018 edition of Labor Express. At the end of every episode of Labor Express Radio, I refer to Chicago as the world capital of the labor movement. The statement, of course, is hyperbole generated out of a deep sense of Chicago pride. In reality, of course, the labor movement has no real capital, no real center. It is an international movement, and the front lines of its battles are always shifting. But there's a kernel of truth to my exaggeration in that Chicago has, and to some degree still does, have a preeminent place in the international history of working people. No event exemplifies this more than the Haymarket tragedy of 1886, which became a source of global inspiration for the international struggle for the working class to reduce the hours of labor. Throughout the 19th century, the central focus of the labor movement was the shortening of the working day and week. Marx considered this demand by organized labor revolutionary, as he argued it struck at the heart of capitalist exploitation itself. The struggle for the 8-hour day cost the lives of many working class heroes and was not universally victorious, at least in the Western industrialized economies, until the mid-20th century. But why did organized labor stop at the 8-hour day and the 5-day work week? Why did the struggle for shorter hours of labor largely vanish for the past 70 or 80 years? Capital's demand to increase the hours of labor never abated. Indeed, the hours of work, especially in the U.S., have crept up in recent years. The 40-hour work week is largely a myth, and most workers in the U.S. work at least 47 hours a week. Various scheduling schemes like 12-hour shifts have added working days to the month and year. Even more deviously, various management practices have squeezed extra minutes and seconds out of every working hour. So why no pushback from labor on the hours of work? To be clear, this retreat by the labor movement on the working day has not been universal. France is a clear example of a case in which workers have successfully demanded a reduction in working hours. The 35-hour work week in France, established in 2000 by a Socialist Party government, is famous or infamous depending on your position in the class divide. But cases like France have been the exception, not the rule. And even in France, the 35-hour work week has been under assault by right-wing governments ever since. So when the powerful German industrial union IG Metall won a new contract earlier this year across a large section of Germany's industrial firms after a series of 24-hour strikes, which included an optional 28-hour work week as well as a 4.3% wage increase, it caught the attention of many in the labor movement around the world, including myself. Many of us asked the question, why not here? Why is this not a more common demand of unions worldwide? Can we revive the centrality of the direction of the working day and week to the goals of organized labor? 2 episodes ago, I discussed the concept of universal basic income, or UBI, in which every citizen of a municipality, state, or nation is guaranteed a basic level of subsistence. As we discussed in that program, this is an idea that has gained popularity in recent years, even among economic elites, especially the Silicon Valley billionaires, who recognize that automation and other developments in the economy will radically disrupt labor markets in the near future. They see UBI as a way to stave off the possibility of social calamity and unrest as unemployment increases and work becomes more precarious as a result. We also discussed that many governments see UBI as a possible way to streamline and, as a result, reduce social expenditures, precisely at a time when those expenditures would likely increase due to labor market disruptions. On that program, economist Dr. Jack Rasmus expressed great skepticism that UBI offered much hope for working people in the face of these economic changes and challenges. Recent UBI experiments mostly seem to offer a below-subsistence existence that cannot offer a life of dignity to workers displaced in this new economy. So what about reducing the hours of socially necessary labor time and sharing out the work and wealth these new technologies are creating? Is this perhaps an alternative strategy for organized labor in the face of economic changes? I was anxious to hear more about the new IG Metall contract and its reduction in working hours, and to discuss some of these big-picture questions with someone familiar with the situation in Germany. I was able to interview Mark Bergfeld, a labor activist and academic living in Germany who works for the global union UNE, by phone last June. The bulk of tonight's program will consist of that interview. But first we have our international labor news update from our friends at Radio Labor based in Canada. This particular episode of Solidarity News is very relevant to my discussion with Mark Bergfeld about fighting for a shorter work week. As I mentioned already, automation will likely lead to large-scale disruptions of labor markets in the coming decades. This could be a reason that unions should embrace new demands like a reduction in working hours. In this edition of Solidarity News, Marc Boulanger talks about a new report on how automation is likely to dramatically reduce jobs in trucking over the coming years, as well as the problem of increasingly precarious jobs in other industries.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labour.
This is a Radio Labour News Update recorded on Monday, July 3rd, 2017. I'm Marc Boulanger. One of the great challenges facing unions which represent transportation workers is the advent of driverless trucks. A new study by the International Transport Forum says that automated freight transport could reduce demand for truck drivers in the US and Europe by 50 to 70% over the next 15 years. The result could be that up to 4.5 million trucking jobs could disappear. One of the organizations involved in producing the new report is the International Transport Workers Federation. The ITF represents more than 16 million workers who are members of 700 unions in 150 countries. Mac Orata is the Inland Transport Secretary of the ITF. He was interviewed at a conference in Leipzig, Germany, where the report about autonomous freight transport was released.
Autonomous freight transport. Is this a good thing? Is this going to be something important for the future?
It could be a good thing if this improves road safety, this reduces carbon emission, if this is efficient, if there's a fairer distribution of the operations, transport operations between the different hours of the day, then perhaps this is a good thing that there is less road congestion, for example, but it should not be at the cost of the workers being displaced without proper compensation or redeployment or training.
What do you see as the big challenges of autonomous road freight?
One big challenge is that we may not know who the new employers would be. For instance, if you have a trucking company in Leipzig, and if there are autonomous trucks, do you need to control it in Leipzig by a local employer? You could have someone controlling the whole system in America or Japan or Cape Town. And then how would we relate to that employer and negotiate our conditions? That's the challenge for us.
What are perhaps the positives for you? What do you see opportunities for your members, for the people you represent?
We could see opportunities that this could create new types of jobs, perhaps more jobs in operation, perhaps not in driving, but in operation, for example. But benefits would also be for the communities and for the society as a whole if there is just transition. But we see a lot of challenges as well as opportunities, and I'll admit this is a kind of a mixed bag for us as much as it is for the employers and the governments.
Fully 10% of the labor force of the United Kingdom is engaged in perilous, insecure work. Trying to help these 3 million workers is the British Trades Union Congress. The TUC represents 5.6 million workers in 50 unions. As part of its campaign to win better conditions for workers in perilous work, the TUC has released a video interview of a young worker employed in the video gaming industry. She asked that her name not be used out of fear of retaliation.
My company is exploiting contracted workers, and I'm one of them. I'm a self-employed contractor working in the gaming industry. I've been working there for come near 2 years, but I'm increasingly frustrated and angry with them. They exploit me and all the other contracted staff. The real difference between permanent and self-employed workers is that they get the benefits and we don't. I don't get sick pay. I don't get holiday pay. So there's no flexibility for me working from home either. Planning the future is near impossible. Trying to get a mortgage, I can't get that. I tried to get the employer to pay into my pension. That doesn't happen for self-employed people like me. I will never be able to retire and receive a decent pension. This type of working culture is grown by silent approval and condoned by the government. The problem is of monstrous size, yet barely ever in the public eye. The current system doesn't help the worker, like me, the tax-paying worker. It helps the exploiter.
And that's it. International labor news you can use. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for working people by working people, and that was our weekly International Labor News update from Solidarity News, produced by Radio Labor in Canada. For more on Radio Labor, see their website at radiolabor.net. Last February, the German union IG Metall, or IG Metall as they refer to it in Germany, which represents industrial workers in a variety of German industries, reached an agreement with employers on a new contract for some 900,000 workers in a host of German industries. The agreement, which was a victory for the union, came after a series of 24-hour strikes, with more threatened if an agreement wasn't reached. It was a demonstration of the power of militant unionism and the willingness to use the strike weapon to achieve real gains for workers. What really caught the attention of labor activists around the world was the announcement that the new contract included an option for a 28-hour work week for workers who so choose to take advantage of it. This on top of a 4.3% wage increase. For many, including myself, it raised the question of whether the example of IG Metall could inspire a revitalization of a demand for a shorter workday and work week among unions internationally. This topic seems all the more relevant given the likelihood of major disruptions to labor markets as a result of increasing automation and other changes in the global economy. On our last program, we discussed the idea of universal basic income, or UBI, a scheme that is gaining support among corporate CEOs who recognize the disruptions to labor markets that are coming from the increased use of automation. They see UBI as a way to potentially forestall possible working class revolt. But what about shortening the working day and week? Is this a response to the same conditions that offers greater benefit to working people? A reduction in the hours of work with no reduction in pay, the demand of the 8 hours movement in the 19th century, certainly seems a much better recipe for a life of dignity for working people than a meager existence on a subsistence income is represented by UBI. Not only do fewer weekly hours of work offer a better work-life balance for working people and greater opportunity for a more self-actualized life, it also has the potential of spreading out the available work to more people. What is most fundamental is a reduction of working hours without a reduction in pay addresses the most important trend in the class war over the last several decades. Skyrocketing increases in productivity coinciding with a relatively flat, if not ultimately declining levels of compensation. The economic elites have been making record profits extracting ever greater levels of productivity from the working class, leading to the massive increase in inequality we see globally in the last several decades. The two direct ways to attack this imbalance is raising wages and reducing the labor time required for the same wage. But is this what is really going on in the case of IG Metall? I reached out to Mark Bergfeld, a German-based labor activist and academic who writes extensively on the working class movement in Germany, to discuss this issue. Mark is a staff member with the international union UNI. I got in touch with Mark through Lauren Ballhorn, a Jacobin contributing editor in Berlin, Germany, and member of Die Linke, a new left-wing party in Germany. Lauren published an article in Jacobin last March entitled Germany's 28-Hour Work Week, which examined the new IG Metall contract. That article and others are available at laborexpress.org. I reached Mark in Berlin by phone in June to get his analysis. A quick heads up to listeners, as this interview was conducted via international phone call, the audio quality is a bit rough, but I ask that you stay tuned anyway, as I think this topic and interview are important for anyone interested in working class struggle. I started by asking Mark exactly what the new IG Metall contract achieved.
If we go back to 2015, it's quite important in terms of the fact that the German economy had continued throughout the economic crisis, unlike in the United States or unlike in Britain, had maintained its manufacturing base because of a policy called crisis corporatism, which said that, okay, the IG Metall will accept certain limitations on wages and certain cuts in return to maintain the manufacturing base. So when the economy then picked up again in 2012, 2013, and it then came to the national collective bargaining negotiations, the IG Metall actually pushed for quite significant wage rises. Back in 2015, they pushed for 5.5%, and concomitantly with that, what we saw was for the first time a significant mobilization of the membership of the IG Metall to support those demands during a collective bargaining round. So we saw them mobilize in a number of key areas, etc. And so they were very successful in actually winning significant wage rises, 4.5% back in 2015, and at the same time, what they were able to put forward was the argument that German export industries are doing as well as they have never done before. Germany is the number one exporter in the world. So why should those very industries which are, creating those kinds of profits actually not benefit? Why should workers not benefit from the economic growth? So fast forward to 2017, 2018, the situation has changed in so far that the agenda has also changed in the wake of the discussion on digitalization and automation, the introduction of Industry 4.0, and we see that Germany with its export industries is actually lagging behind other nation states in pushing forward this automation, and in particularly it comes to a standoff between the IG Metall and the German state and employers at Siemens, the big German company. And there you saw that Siemens wanted to close a number of different enterprises across the country. And so then the IG Metall starts to devise a strategy in which it pushes for continuous wage rises, which because of the continued growth, as I've previously outlined, but it also starts to deal with the issue of how will automation and digitalization affect workers, and how will it also affect collective bargaining. So I think against the background of those changes, economic growth and automation and digitalization, the IG Metall placed itself on the one hand of continuing strong sectoral bargaining, collective bargaining on the one hand, and finding individual solutions to the challenge of automation and digitalization, where the future is unknown, to what extent certain jobs might be replaced by robots in the future.
Right. And that's something I want to come back to, is the issue of how this, is possibly a response to automation as well as other changes in the economy. So let's definitely come back to that topic. But basically this recent contract, right, it's kind of complicated because the 28-hour work week is not necessarily universal. It's kind of, I guess, up to the individual worker to some degree as to whether they want to adopt that schedule. And it's for a 2-year period. Is that right?
Yeah. So it isn't in the mainstream media, particularly in the English-speaking world. The 28-hour work week demand was portrayed as collective, covering all workers. We need to be clear about it that workers can opt into such a 28-hour work week, and that it remains an individual provision in the collective bargaining contract. Now, achieving this is always a question of the balance of forces within a particular company, right? You might have the right, the lawful right to do so, but will you eventually do so if you think, well, my company might be, in financial problems, and if I go down to a 28-hour work week, then I'll be also one of the first people to go when the company starts to get rid of people. That's the one question. The second question is whether it actually starts to tackle the question of what automation and what digitalization will bring. Of course, the new technologies which will be implemented could improve workers' lives and shorten the working day, but by putting it as an individual choice, it's not actually connecting to the discussion of a 35-hour work week that was held in the 1980s, nor does it connect back into the traditional labor movement slogan of 8-hour work, 8-hour leisure, and 8-hour sleep, but it actually is dealt with in a managerial fashion of work-life balance, I would say. And so we need to be very wary about the kind of implications for, in terms of collective bargaining, but as well as in terms of how we see working time as a collective workers issue rather than one simply of individual time management and a person's individual ability to negotiate that.
Right. And it's interesting, I was looking at the picture of what kind of working hours German workers generally face, and it's a complicated issue because there's a great kind of stratification within, it seems, the German working class. On one hand, you have the increasing precarious workforce, what they sometimes call the precariat now, right, where you've got a lot of workers that are underemployed that are working as little as 12 hours a week, and then you've got high demand workers sometimes working 50, 60 hours a week. I know that, of course, the German unions tried to establish a 35-hour work week in previous decades, and that's been true to some degree for some, industrial workers with strong unions. This 24-hour work week is definitely a step in the right direction, it seems, in terms of balancing out what workers need in terms of hours of work, but it's definitely a complicated picture.
Yeah, so I think you point to something very important that we need to really bear in mind, and that is, first of all, I think this provision goes into the right direction of putting the discussion of working time back onto the agenda. That is a very welcome step. Now, this is particularly the case given that what we see happening in Austria at the moment, that the conservative Euro-fascist government led by Sebastian Kurz is seeking to introduce the 12-hour day. We see in France that Emmanuel Macron wants to lift the cap on the 35-hour week in his labor laws, and so we need to welcome this step by the IG Metall, precisely by that fact. The question then becomes one: is to what extent this is actually going to be tenable for workers of all kinds, because at the moment what we have is what academics have called the lumpiness of work, right? And the lumpiness of work is that those people who want to work shorter hours or want to work part-time aren't able to do so because the company, for example, demands that they work longer. And those that actually would like to work longer hours and would like to have more earnings aren't able to do so either. So we're stuck in a situation in which there's no ideal market outcome, so to speak. So in that sense, the trade union, as a mediator in that employment relationship, plays a significant role in shaping what kind of direction that goes to. The problem, however, in modern management is that work is no longer organized 9 to 5, right? It's like, because you have just-in-time production, you have just-in-time supply chains, right. You have 24/7 warehouses operating at 24/7. So work from management side is organized around tasks and the compression of tasks into smaller and smaller time units. That's how management and capital makes its money. And so the question is like, what content or what activities do you pack into those 28 hours? So we actually need to talk about the fact that a lot of precarious workers, even though they might be on 0-hour contracts, even though they might have a 10-hour working week, actually might be doing 20 hours of work in those 10 hours. or if you see the fact that people are working way beyond a 40-hour or 35-hour work week, that often what is being pushed into that is far greater. So how do we also deal with how management utilizes workers' time within that? So, and there's where the complexity comes about, because if you fast forward it into the day and age where we supposedly have completely automated factories and only a few workers left, of course, into a 28-hour work week, you'll have massive productivity gains, and workers' wages will not be following up with productivity. And this is the crux. Will workers' wages continue to rise with productivity? This is a basic trade union demand. At the moment, workers' wages, even in Germany, are lagging behind. And the 28-hour work week is partially trying to readjust it, but it only goes so far.
That's a really interesting observation. Let's kind of just look at this kind of the broader level real quick too, which is, in the early days of the labor movement globally, the reduction of the working day was one of the central demands. If you go back to the 19th century, the TUC in the 19th century, even revolutionaries like Marx saw this demand for a reduction of the working day as kind of one of the most revolutionary demands of organized labor. Unions fought in the United States first for a 10-hour day and later for an 8-hour day. I come from Chicago, so I'm keenly aware of how workers fought and died for the 8-hour day. Gradually in the 20th century, that became basically the standard. In the U.S., it was pretty much established in the 1937 Fair Labor Standards Act, and by mid-20th century, it became kind of a somewhat universal standard to have the 8-hour day. Of course, we've been going the other direction in most places ever since, right? So U.S. workers, full-time workers, are working on an average about 47 hours a week these days, as well as the growth of the precarious labor sector where they're underemployed. So you got full-time workers working longer than 8 hours or longer than 40 hours a week, and again, the people who are underemployed working less. But unions, generally speaking, have not made a reduction of the working day a central demand for many decades now. Why do you think that's the case?
So, if we go back to the discussions of the 1980s in Europe, at least, where the issue of working time reduction was a central demand by the European trade unions, both France as well as in Germany, in Austria, in Italy. What we saw was that what was being done was demanding this collectively, and effectively what you see is that within the 1990s, suddenly, and the fall of the Soviet Union, you see that neoliberalism in Germany and in Western Europe far later than in the United States or in Britain for that matter, really becomes dominant. So neoliberalism is a far younger phenomena in most parts of Western Europe than, for example, in the United States or in Latin America for that point. But the thing is that the German trade unions or the Western trade unions actually held on to some form of corporatist partnership to a lesser or to a bigger degree. And so when neoliberalism and neoliberal work reforms were started to be implemented, a lot of the responses from the official trade union side were to continue to cooperate with the state and adopt the statist logic in a way, remain a trustworthy coalition partner, seek out the best interest for industry, etc. And so a lot of the time, in times of globalization, in times to defend, for example, Germany's manufacturing base at Opel, for example, which then was bought by GM, etc., what we saw was a very defensive position of the trade unions. And in those days, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, it became very obvious that working time reduction was no longer the agenda. The agenda shifted to how do you actually retain, jobs, retain jobs. And so what we see is that the defensive position of the trade unions, on one hand, led to no longer discussing working time reduction. Secondly, the kind of goals or the achievements that had been successful in France, for example, winning the 35-hour work week, or in Italy, winning more autonomy, which was turned then by business into work-life balance, and all of those questions no longer were political issues or no longer were seen as trade union issues, but through neoliberal governmentality were deemed individual issues, which the individual had to deal with. And so I think this combination of, on one hand, being in the defensive and those questions being taken out of the trade union realm into the individual realm of where it's about your individual time management meant that these questions haven't been addressed by unions unless unions are concretely under attack, like as we see in France, as we see in Austria at this given moment. Then we see them being politicized once again.
We need to take a station ID break, but when we return, I'll continue my discussion with German-based labor activist and academic Mark Bergfeld about the German union IG Metall's victory in winning a 28-hour work week. You're listening to Labor Express Radio, which calls only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. As you heard in the first part of my interview with Germany-based labor activist and academic Mark Bergfeld, IG Metall's new contract with German industry creating an optional 28-hour work week is putting the discussion of reduction in the hours of labor back on the agenda of some unions. The second part of my interview with Mark delves deeper into the state of the struggle over the length of the working day and week. Again, I realize that audio recorded over international phone lines doesn't yield the highest quality audio, but I do ask that you excuse the rough quality of the audio and continue to listen to what I feel is a very important interview on a very important topic.
You point out, too, that, of course, the situation in Europe is different than the U.S., or has been at least times in the past where there have been a more concerted effort, at least, as you pointed out, up until the 90s, to reduce the working day in Europe. France did achieve that in the 80s with the 35-hour work week, though, as you point out, that's been under threat. In the last presidential elections in France, there was a great deal of debate about whether or not they should move away from the 35-hour work week. A lot of the experiments that were done in places like Sweden and so on were not continued forward. So there's definitely a push in Europe. And you mentioned the situation with the Austrian government. There's definitely a push in Europe to increase the working day, even though in the past in Europe it has been a more significant gain that we've seen in the U.S.
Yeah. So there is the European Working Time Directive, which is the law which governs European labor relations and sets the minimum standard, which says you can't work more than 48 hours a week on average. And this working time directive already states that it's 48 hours, 48 hours a week. So if that's the minimum, governments have used that directive. For example, the British government has used that directive to continuously push, workers to work longer hours. But there's even a provision within the working time directive that you can opt out as an individual employee, as far as I'm aware of. So the thing is, working time is continuously under threat. The question for the labor movement and for progressive parties across the European Union and across Europe is whether they're able to politicize this issue, because at present it is always being politicized by the right. And the left liberal kind of wing of politics in Europe has continuously spoken about, work-life balance, which doesn't, kind of individual time management, which completely individualizes the issue of working time. And if you look back at the workers' movement, it is absolutely, as you pointed out, one of the key issues of how do you reduce working time and use the machines and use the technologies, in order to improve workers' lives and give them more free time, right? That's,
right.
Everyone from Lafargue, to Marx, saw this as a central plank in the fight for the labor movement.
Right. And you've already mentioned the fact that, of course, the big crisis, I think, facing workers globally right now is the growth of automation and the growth of AI, of artificial intelligence, and so on, and replacing work. And so it seems to me, I'm also working on another program right now on this concept of UBI, Universal Basic Income, which it's interesting is being pushed a lot by a lot of the corporate elites, particularly in the tech sector, right? They seem to think that the solution to how we're going to deal with automation is by providing some kind of universal basic income. There's all kinds of problems with that concept, which we won't go into here, that I'm developing another program that will address that. But it seems to me another way to address the automation question is this issue of reduction of the working day. In fact, that if we had an economy that really worked in favor of the working class, that's exactly what automation would be bringing, right? It would be reducing the amount of work that workers need to do without reducing their standard of living. So should this become a more central demand of unions as a way of addressing automation?
So personally, I think that what we need there's a two-pronged strategy that labor movements in Europe need to pursue. First of all, it is to defend the current, and in every nation state or European state, it's a bit different, but to actually defend the social kind of insurance and the social system which different countries have developed over time, right? Those social systems and welfare systems are the product of, labor victories of the past. So it's actually part and point to develop them. Many of those social systems go far beyond the universal basic income,
right,
in the sense that you have transfer through the social systems, you have transfer payments for an individual household that far exceed even if 2 or 3 people receive the universal basic income. For example, I live in Belgium now. Childcare is completely paid for. Now, imagine if they take childcare out of the social system,
right,
and give you a lump sum of money. You will not get anywhere close to, being able to afford to pay for childcare, for example. If you take universal basic income, and the main proposition is, okay, people can, do whatever they want to with that money, it effectively has meant that universal basic income, it will leave, different services which are currently provided by the state, etc. Citizens will have to pay for it. I think one of the interesting arguments for the labor movement is, and which we need to grapple with in terms of the battle of ideas, is the one that people will have time to do what they really want to do, and that will also strengthen the collective bargaining position of unions. So that means, in other words, because people get a lump sum of 1,000 or 1,200 euros, that will give, will perhaps mean that people actually are more willing to strike or more willing to take workplace action because they no longer need to be afraid to be without money at the end of the month and can even face repression.
Right.
I don't know. I don't have a straightforward answer for that. All I would say is that, people willing to take action on a collective basis require some form also of collective consciousness. If the social systems that Europe has are based on the solidarity principle, that everyone pays in, that everyone receives it, etc., and they're not just a cash transfer, which creates a level of solidarity. I'm not sure whether receiving 1,000 or 1,200 euros in your bank account every month will actually increase that notion of solidarity. I'm skeptical about that.
Right. Yeah, and I apologize. I think my question was a little confusing. You're absolutely right. I think there's all kinds of problems with the UBI, particularly what you point out that if they try to use that to replace the current social systems that are in place, it would be a disaster. The one possible benefit, as you point out, is that if it allows workers more independence to be able to take strike action or to pursue other goals, because they're not afraid of being out on the street if they don't work. That's certainly true. What my question was, though, more was in opposition to UBI, the idea of the reduction of the working day. Is that a demand that unions should be making,
Okay.
More globally as a solution or a response to the crisis of automation?
Yeah. I think generally, technologies are never neutral. They can be used for whatever purposes. So the question is how do we actually use the current wave of automation and the current Industrial Revolution 4.0 to actually pursue a further reduction in working time, but as well as start, taxing those companies which are automating and making windfall profits from those automation. So I think that those two demands need to go hand in hand, because if you start to reduce workers' working hours and you start to see automation getting rid of jobs, it's not a zero-sum game. So some workers will lose their jobs due to automation. The question is, how will you retrain them, or what kind of other critical infrastructures can the state, build now that, some of these very industries are automated. So I think the two working time reduction and automation are linked, but I don't think that it's a simple zero-sum game of where you see factories automated, we get working time reduction, everyone stays in employment but works less. That is, under the current, balance of forces, that is wishful thinking. I think what is much more intelligent is to say, okay, how do we use the introduction of those new technologies to, train up and retrain? How do we use the productivity gains in order to use, develop new kinds of spin-off technologies, etc., that can solve some of the world's problems like climate change, right?
Right.
Trade unionists, those are the pressing questions, I think.
Right.
Rather than thinking about it as a zero-sum game. I know that a lot of people do, but yeah.
Yes, and
I differ on that one.
And you've made a point frequently too that I really appreciate, which is that the way this demand for a reduction of the working day is made is really important as well. You point out the fact that kind of the corporate approach to this, the employer approach to this, is to approach it as an individual issue, as a work-life balance. That what unions need to be doing is making this as a class demand, not as a collective demand, not as an individual demand.
Yes. Just again on that, I think if you look particular at the Italian autonomist tradition that came about in the 1960s and 1970s, they showed very clearly that in Mario Tronti in Labor and Capital shows how workers demanded autonomy in their jobs, but as well as in their wider lives, in their social lives, in their family lives, in all spheres of life. And effectively, management was able to take that demand for autonomy, for the reduction of working hours, and turn it against themselves and adapt it. So what they turned out of our class-based demand of working time reduction, they turned it into work-life balance. Mm-hmm. And so if you see management books these days, they will all talk about reducing working time. They will all talk about time management, etc., work less, But when they talk about working less, they actually talk about it as an individual choice. They talk about it as an individual responsibility of the worker to work less. So regardless of what the external circumstances are, and ultimately what they also talk about is compressing more and more activities into shorter time, and we see this most accentuated in the gig economy, for example, where you're no longer paid for your entire working time, whether you're a courier riding on a bike delivering food parcels. It means you're on the streets for 8 hours, but you're only paid for the pickups and the delivery,
Right.
which perhaps comprise 20% or 30% of your entire working day.
Right.
So this is the point. It's like, how does management shift the frontier of control to force more and more tasks into shorter time?
Right.
And so without discussing the content of the work, discussions on working time remain limited.
Right, right. And as you pointed out previously, too, the big question here is productivity, right? So technology and these kind of, even these programs like work-life balance programs and so on, are all about increasing that productivity in the time that's allowed, which is already, at this point, as you point out, workers globally have seen, are producing value at a much higher rate, but are not being compensated for that increase in productivity.
Yeah. So, look, basic economistic trade unionism puts forward the notion that wages should rise corresponding to productivity. That link was broken I think in the U.S. it was broken sometime in the 1970s. In Germany it was broken in the 1990s. Around the globe it was broken.
Right.
So the question is like, can workers actually start to get wages which go hand in hand with productivity? Because that doesn't even correspond to a real wage rise. That should be the normal. You work more, you pack more boxes at Amazon, you take care of more elderly people in your care home, you manufacture more auto parts, you should be remunerated for it.
Right.
So that's basic trade unionism. And so I think we need to link working time, production, and ultimately ultimately the content of work. Those are three key arenas of struggle. But I think that there are massive challenges that we face in tackling these issues as well. And I think that's really the discussion. That's a discussion for another time. But I think that's the kind of discussion, like where do we identify obstacles in doing so?
Right, right. One more thing that I want to make sure that we discuss here too is how IG Metall was able to actually win this new contract. I think it's definitely a step forward. The 28-hour working week is a step forward, despite the limitations that there are to it, which we've discussed. And I appreciate your pointing that out. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. But the way they achieved it, I think, is as important to discuss, right? Which is that this came out of a series of strike actions. Just like the demand for the reduction of the working day has seemed to slip off the radar of unions, for the last several decades. The use of the strike as the main tool, the main weapon of organized labor is another thing that's kind of, unfortunately, it seems like a dying, an endangered species for the last several decades. But it was the willingness of IG Metall to use a strike weapon that really won this contract. Is that right?
Yeah, so you need to, just for listeners, I think it's important to stress that Germany has some of the lowest strike rates within the European Union, and continues to do so. And the strikes in Germany, there's two forms of strike. So first of all, there's the warning strike, which is comparable to a lunchtime walkout. The warning strikes can happen before or during collective bargaining rounds, and were first invented in the late 1960s by workers themselves to actually force rank and file pressure onto management. However, they became very routinized in the last couple of years. And what we saw and I go back to 2015 on this, is that we saw those warning strikes became much more militant than they have been in previous years. They much more well attended than in previous years. And what we saw is that the workers didn't only line up with whistles and whistle, but actually started also chanting and started raising political slogans as well. So the thing that to bear in mind is that these strikes for the reduction of workers' hours are those warning strikes, and some lasted up to even 24 hours, and are quite disruptive in export industries such as the IG Metall organized. And a lot of those workers that had been part of 2015 of the collective bargaining round actually were the core of this round of strikes. And so it's very significant that the IG Metall continuously now in every 2 to 3 years is mobilizing its workers and is mobilizing its members to strike for various demands. This represents a sea change in Germany. The question is whether it can be used, whether this trend will continue in the future. But let's be clear about it. It's still very, very low. The strike figures in Germany are very low.
But do you think that the willingness to use the strike in this case was key to why they were able to win the demands they were?
Yeah, so there were calculations which came out at the time of how much economic damage was caused by one of the 24-hour strikes, and the figures are I don't have the figures in my head any longer, and I don't want to say anything wrong, but they're absolutely astounding. So you can probably figure that sections of employers were saying, like, we need to bring an end to this strike because the short-term damage will exceed the long-term, IG Metall's long-term goal of establishing, of winning their demands. So I think on a rational basis, I would say that it definitely contributed to the employers caving to this demand.
Well, Mark, I really appreciate you taking out time to talk with me. This is a great conversation. There is so much here that we could unpack further, and we could be talking for hours longer. But unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that. But I really appreciate you talking with me.
Thank you, Jerry.
On the Labor Express Facebook page, I have links to several articles that further explore the new IG Metall contract. So be sure to check them out at laborexpress.org. This topic of fighting for a reduction in the hours of labor is something I will return to on future episodes of Labor Express, so make sure to keep tuning in. That's all for tonight's program. Labor Express is a nonprofit 501c3 member of IBEW Local 1220. The views expressed on Labor Express are those of its producers and those of IBEW. Labor Express is a production of the Committee for Labor Access in Chicago, the world capital of the labor movement. The song is our theme is called Worker Songs, written by Ed Pickford and recorded by the Dropkick Murphys. Tune in next Sunday at 8 p.m. for another edition of Labor Express.
Yeah, this one's for the workers who toil night and day, by hand and by brain, to earn your pay, who for centuries don't pass for no